Today, at the Civil Society 13th Ministerial Conference in Abu Dhabi press conference calling for a pro-development outcome and an end to the WTO expansion agenda. My name is Deborah James, and I'm the Director of International Programs at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and I facilitate the global Our World Is Not For Sale network, which is a network of organizations and social movements worldwide fighting the current model of corporate globalization embodied in the global trading system of the WTO. Our World Is Not For Sale is committed to a sustainable, socially just, democratic, and accountable multilateral trading system. And you can see our website, ourworldisnotforsale.net, for myriad briefings, articles, and letters from civil society about the negotiations. So we have at least about 50 civil society folks here at MC13 from 21 countries: Argentina, Australia, Bangladesh, Belgium, Bolivia, Brazil, Germany, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Kenya, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, the Philippines, Spain, Switzerland, Uganda, the US, and Zimbabwe. We also had 2 delegates who intended to come from Nigeria, but they were denied visas. We represent communities that will be affected by the outcome of the negotiations. And we also have a directory of civil society experts who are here at the back of the room, and you are welcome to call them or email them or WhatsApp them for interviews. So please take that if you didn't already get a copy of it. So there's a very anti-development text on the table in fishery subsidies, in agriculture, that will do little to address global food security or farmers' or fishers' livelihood, while punting serious reforms off to the future. And perhaps most existentially, developed countries are pushing a quote-unquote WTO reform agenda that threatens the very basis of the WTO multilateral and consensus in favor of plurilaterals and an even more direct role and power for corporations, expanding the failed WTO model rather than transforming it. We're also very concerned about the WTO Secretariat's support for these illegal plurilaterals. We're also very concerned about the process of this meeting. At MC12, if you will remember, the chair actually gabbled through the final text without the delegates having seen access to the final text. And we exhort the WTO not to allow the same outrageous behavior to happen here in Abu Dhabi. In the lead up to the MC, there has also been a huge acceleration of meetings with many tracks happening at the same time. This is very exclusionary towards many, many WTO members who only have a few or even one delegate in Geneva. So in spite of the DG hyping inclusivity, civil society has also faced very exclusionary behavior here at the MC. At other international governance organizations, NGO observers are welcomed to the deliberations and permitted to make interventions on the record. The WTO has long fallen short in this regard, but the silencing we have experienced thus far here in Abu Dhabi is shocking, even by the low bar of the WTO. Yesterday, several accredited NGO representatives entered the ADNEC building to distribute information to delegates outside an investment facilitation event. But immediately after being permitted through security, they were stopped and searched by the local security. Their papers were taken away, they were detained and escorted off the premises. And a separate group distributing a press release to delegates was also similarly asked to leave. Another colleague was prevented from entering the conference due to wearing a traditional piece of clothing that was rejected as politically sensitive and potentially affecting the security of the conference, even though the official invitation says that participants are invited to wear their national dress. The imposition of restricted areas has also prevented us from meeting with reporters in the press area and using the WTO facilities usually available. It is totally unacceptable for the WTO and the United Arab Emirates to host this conference without guaranteeing that our rights to advocacy and free speech are respected, and the outcomes of MC13 can only address the issues of concern to civil society if we are able to engage effectively. And this is the WTO's responsibility to ensure our participants' rights are respected. So turning to the substance of the negotiations, we have a beautiful diversity of organizations here today. Each one will speak for themselves for a few minutes on key topics. And again, please see the directory for more information about people to interview, and you can also find a lot more information at ourworldisnotforsale.net. Our first speaker today is Kinda Mohammadieh. She is a senior researcher and legal advisor with the Third World Network, and she will speak on the Ministerial Declaration and Development.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So we heard this morning, do you hear me better now?
Yes.
Super, okay. So we heard this morning the Ministerial Conference being presented as an opportunity to continue to prove that the WTO can deliver and is relevant. And in this context, several statements, including by the chair of the Ministerial, stress the need for reform to address the current and future issues and the need for new ways of working at the WTO. We say that the aim of reforming the WTO and the ability of the WTO to be relevant cannot be decoupled from the developmental objective and the ability to deliver on the development issues under WTO law. These have been pillars, fundamental pillars, since the establishment of the WTO and remain very much relevant. Otherwise, the WTO can never claim the relevancy in today's context. Rather, the WTO will remain harmful to the majority of the constituencies in the majority of its members from among developing countries. So the notion of development, if we want to look at the history of the WTO, is core to the objectives of this institution as expressed in the preamble of the Marrakesh, the Mother Agreement, the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the organization. And today, in this world, we see that the development challenge is more intense than when the WTO has been established. We see that the development divide persists, but the exposure to vulnerabilities emanating from the external context that the trade system creates are more deep and long-lasting in terms of their effects on the developmental trajectories in the form of industrialization and sustainable and structural transformation in our countries. But we need to realize something that might not be very obvious outside the realm of the house of the WTO, that inside the WTO there's an assault on the fundamentals of development. There is an attempt to define what development means and to position the notion of development as an issue that is of importance to deliver on the historical demands of developing countries in regards to the development outcome, particularly the issue of strengthening special and differential treatment, which have been embedded in the core agreement, but in a way that is very superficial and is not operational, and also the long-lasting demands in terms of addressing the structural imbalances and deficiencies in the current rules, because most of the current members were not around the table when the rules were initially designed. So in this ministerial, we invite you to look at what is happening in the discussions on the ministerial declaration, because there is currently nothing for development. So basically, if the text remains as it is, we call on developing countries to reject accepting the ministerial declaration because there is nothing there for them in this regard. And if actually this ministerial is going to deliver on this issue, then we need to see the clear language on the request by the developing countries to strengthen and make more effective special and differential treatment to be part of the core text. We need to be aware that there should not be false solutions and empty promises on this issue, but rather we need a reaffirmation on the mandate on this issue and the importance of imminent deliverance after MC13. This language is now in an annex to the draft ministerial declaration. The fate of this annex, we don't know what it could be. It could be completely dropped. But basically, most of the issues of concern to developing countries is in this annex. Before closing, I would just say as well that there is another issue to pay attention to in this annex, which is the language on policy space and industrial development. This is a call by the African group and the other developing countries to have a mandate post MC13 in order to review existing rules under several agreements of the WTO in order to raise the barriers they create for countries, developing countries, in their industrialization and structural transformation. And without this, again, I stress there's no point of going forward with the Ministerial Declaration.
Thank you so much, Kinda. Next, we'll hear from Ranja Sengupta, who is a senior researcher with the Third World Network from India on agriculture and food security issues.
Thanks, Deborah. And I think on that development note, let me continue into agriculture, because I think all of us know that developing countries agreed to put in agriculture in the WTO agreements because they were told that, one, they would be getting the policy space to develop their agriculture sector, and this is in fact true of all WTO agreements, as Kinda you were saying. And also they were told that the massive Western subsidies, which were hurting farmers across the developing world, would be disciplined, that they could use the WTO institution in a fair way to discipline those subsidies. And now nearly 29 years, right, down the line, we still do not see that happening. So what are we seeing now in MC13? I mean, we've closely followed the negotiations leading up to MC13, and we know there are, these outstanding issues, mandated issues, such as the one is the permanent solution on public stockholding, which is very, very important for farmers in developing countries. But it is about the subsidy given to farmers for procurement for a public distribution program. And in all our countries, I come from India, but it's not just India, many developing countries and LDCs use such public food programs. And the WTO says that the subsidy they give to consumers is fine, but not the one they give to producers. But for us, that subsidy is key to ensuring both production and livelihoods of farmers. But that permanent solution, along with the special safeguard mechanism, which is to protect against sudden rise in imports, which has created immense uncertainty, volatility, destroyed farmers' livelihoods across our countries. And also cotton. I mean, many issues were there on cotton, but the key issue is developed country subsidies on cotton, which has harmed livelihoods of farmers in Africa, in Asia. But all these issues which were being discussed in the main agriculture committee, COAS, they are blocked. And this is not, I mean, we've seen in MC12 they were blocked. In Buenos Aires in 2017 these were blocked, in spite of a reaffirmation of the mandate from the Nairobi Ministerial. Many of these mandates go way back actually, but these three were clearly reaffirmed in Nairobi. But still we do not see a solution. The developed countries, also the agriculture exporter group, they have repeatedly blocked this. On the other hand, we see that there is kind of this push to get any export restrictions removed or increase market access, increase transparency. All these have been problematic for developing countries. So what we see on agriculture is a very, very anti-development agenda. And just two interesting things. So while this is the state of affairs, and we are not even expecting any concrete outcome in this ministerial, and we don't even know whether there will be an outcome document, because we hear that each time developing countries are blamed for collapse of talks, we hear this time there's massive difference of opinion among developed countries and also the Keynes group. So we'll see that. But just to end that, food security, in MC12 we had this food insecurity declaration, but food security or insecurity has been used in parallel to the main agriculture negotiations. And interestingly, it's LDCs and developing countries and net food importing developing countries who are really facing the crisis from this, from the COVID pandemic, from the Russia-Ukraine war that generated a food crisis in 2022. But they are saying, what do we need? We need the AOA rules to be fair. We need more policy space. We need the WTO to give us more policy space so that we are able to support and augment production and productivity in our countries, support farmers, support food security domestically, because we cannot rely on this very concentrated, very volatile and very unfair global agricultural market anymore. But what they are being told repeatedly, no, you don't need to do anything, just keep your markets open, you just liberalize and everything will be good. So countries with huge subsidies and who are major agricultural exporters will sell you everything, don't worry about a thing. That's what they're told, and they are also now being told that, let's have a reset agenda, completely new view of agriculture, new reform, and so everything, is for the future and so on. But this is an open-ended, unknown agenda that they are being asked to sign on to, but at the same time, there is no resolution on this outstanding mandated issue, which most developing countries are saying are key to their view of agricultural reform or their view of their solution to food security problems. So this is where we are at, and I really do not know what we will finally get out of MC13. And I just also wanted to add one line. We have an event on agriculture immediately after this, 3 to 4:30 in this room. So if any of you want to stay on, you are most welcome to. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raja. Next, we will hear from Baikoman Saragi from Kiara Fisherfolk Organization from Indonesia.
Thank you, Deborah. The first things that I want to say that fisheries subsidies are rejected by developed countries because it's so discriminative for us, such as Indonesia. And meanwhile, the developed countries and large-scale fisheries can still maintain the subsidies as long as they can implement sustainable fisheries management measures. And the several subsidies fisheries that will be eliminated by the draft text is like social charge, insurance, price support for fishing catch, and subsidies that cover fishing losses. This is contrary to Indonesian laws and regulation, which clearly state that small-scale fisheries are entitled to subsidies from the government of Indonesia, such as fuel subsidies, fisheries insurance, life insurance, fishing risk granted, and realizing fish prices that benefit for fisher folks. And the number of fisher folk in Indonesia is 2.4 million people, and there are 3.9 million fisherwomen who involved in pre-production and post-production activities in small-scale fisheries. The biggest expenses that small-scale fisheries buy is fuel, and the fuel in draft text that will be prohibited. Now, before I will closing my statement I will say that fishery subsidies will have been granted in Indonesian constitution and laws. If fishery subsidies are alienated and prohibited by WTO, it will be against our constitution, Indonesian constitution, and the WTO will interfere in Indonesian constitution and will change our regulation, Indonesian regulation. So it will be harmful for small-scale fisheries in Indonesia and the other developing countries if the subsidies fisheries are limited or are prohibited. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Wonderful. And I'd just like to point out that our website, ourworldisnotforsale.net, has a fisheries section, ourworldisnotforsale/fish, which has a number of letters from civil society, from Bickerman's organization, from India Fisherfolk Organization, as well as analysis and briefs from the Pacific Network on Globalization, from the Third World Network, explaining in intricate detail all the technical issues in the fisher issue, and the same thing for on agriculture. There are letters there from civil society, from farmers' organizations, as well as analysis on the issues. Next, we're going to have Parminderjeet Singh. He is with the JustNet Coalition in India to speak about the e-commerce moratorium.
Thank you, Deborah. You just heard some very important issues like with agriculture and fisheries, which directly impact people as being key at the WTO Ministerial. But let me dare say that one of the most consequential decisions which will be taken at this Ministerial is a very harmless and innocent looking issue of continuation of moratorium on custom duties on digitalizable products. It looks very harmless because first of all it's just a continuation of moratorium, therefore it's a temporary measure, and whoever even understands what digitalizable products are, and most countries stay under the radar and say whoever wants our support, you probably give it because it's not very, very important, and probably even this impression goes around that this is not a very important issue. So I'll try to establish how this issue is of fundamental, foundational importance to the emerging digital economy and digital society. Now we all know that border taxes, which are custom duties and tariffs, are very important. It's always been important historically for nations to shape their domestic economies and industrialize. For example, the US in the 19th century largely used tariff measures to industrialize rapidly and come up with the standards of Europe and then even beat it. And there were very heavy taxation, border taxation, heavy tariffs which were used in that process. And others have been doing it. They've been doing it for agricultural products, they're doing industrial products, and that's a normal thing. And that's the reason WTO exists, because there are tariffs. And people come here and they adjust their tariffs and negotiate around the tariffs. If there weren't tariffs, there would be no WTO, I understand, in the traditional sense. So what traditionally has happened is that there are border taxes on goods, because goods are what actually cross borders normally. So people have put border taxes on goods. Now services would never normally cross borders. If there's a medical professional has to come to you and give services, the hotel services, you have to go to a hotel to get the services. So there was a proximity issue about services, and there were services were never taxed at the borders because traditionally that's how services used to be. But we all know in the digital economy that's not true, and services not only increasingly travel across borders, which we all know, our WhatsApp, our Ubers, our Amazon services, they cross borders, but the submission here is that very soon the biggest value flow across borders would be services. Now that changes the whole thing, because earlier it was goods and goods were taxed at the borders, and now services being the biggest part of cross-border flows is a strange issue. And traditionally there has been no taxes on services, and US, who normally looks much ahead as the most powerful actor in this arena in 1998, said, well, you know, there's some confusions about what is service and what is product, and to, you know, not get into that confusion, let's put a moratorium on anything which is confused between being a digital product or a digital service. The example at that time was that you can buy music CDs and buy movie CDs, but increasingly you can also download that. So when the CD crosses borders, there are taxes on it, but what happens if you're just downloading it? And US said, since there is a confusion around this, let's make a moratorium till we get things clear and not tax them. And that's okay. In 1998, there was a lot of confusion, but 25 years after that, the understanding of what a digital economy is, how dominant it is in our lives, and how dominant it's going to going ahead, and the fact that almost every sector and every product increasingly has a digital element in it, including agriculture. For example, what Ranja was talking, we're talking about input costs for farmers. Increasingly, there are already 3,000 digital startups in India in the agriculture sector. Increasingly, very expensive input element for farmers would be digital services, digital advisories, and there are lots of digital things which I won't go into. The question is whether and how to tax them. So the moratorium has continued, and now increasingly the powerful guys have started to use language like software is included in this moratorium, and interpretative tests say that services are included in this moratorium. So the effort finally is that when we are in the middle of a digital economy and digital flows are going across borders, we have already given a commitment we will never tax the digital services. And that's the reason this moratorium exists. And once we understand, now the issue is not whether the tax is being laid today or not, but whether we are ready to sacrifice our right to tax digital services on the borders. And this is the reason that the moratorium should not be continued. And I think that gives a very strong signal that the countries have a right not only to border tax digital services, but to use it to shape their own domestic economies. And rather than use national security measures, which increasingly US and EU uses against China, which is the way they now stop many kind of digital services and products, the traditional economic measure has been tariff. And therefore, the issue of discontinuing this moratorium is very important, and the groups who have assembled here largely support that we should make the statement that the e-com moratorium is discontinued and every country has a right to tax digital services or digitalizable products in the way they want, and if they don't want it, that's up to them. So I'd stop here, and obviously it's a complex issue, and I'm happy to take any questions about it. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. Next we'll have Jane Kelsey, who is a professor emeritus from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and she will talk about the joint statement initiatives and the lack of democracy in the WTO.
Thank you, Deborah, and my apologies for being late. I had to come from another meeting. And that means also I'm not that sure what's already been said, so I hopefully won't be repetitive. The context for the JSIs is basically that in the old days of the GATT, created in 1947, and then the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1995, there was an assumption by the major powers that they could make the rules, and that the rules would be designed for them and that they would remain in control. And now, several decades on from the establishment of the World Trade Organization, they've discovered that that's no longer the case in the WTO. And unable to get their own way, they are basically remaking the rules. And they're remaking the rules unilaterally. You may hear this week a reference to a phrase, reform by doing. And reform by doing basically means not reform by the rules, but reform by pragmatic and to a large extent self-serving activities that fall outside the rules, and then work out how to make the organisation shift to accommodate them. And we see that in the draft outcomes document with quite a lot of very vague phrases that if you look at the explanatory note to the draft ministerial declaration, you will see what the subtexts in fact mean. And they're about remaking the organisation in the interests, again, of the major powers. So there are three pillars that are key to the WTO, and I'm sure that we've already heard on the panel about the breakdown of the appellate body, and there are also issues around the second pillar, which is notification and surveillance. But the one alongside the appellate body that is especially noteworthy is the breakdown of the negotiations capacity of the WTO. And so that has become a major initiative of countries determined to remake the WTO that began back in 2017 at the 11th Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires, where there were a number of breakaway groups of members who issued statements that were known as joint declarations, and those joint declarations foreshadowed negotiations in a number of areas of interest to those groups of countries. They have since become known as the Joint Statement Initiatives to negotiate agreements in those areas. Three of them are particularly advanced. There are a couple of important common features to each of them. One is that they operate without a mandate, and and they operate outside the mandated bodies of the World Trade Organization, and sometimes in parallel to or contradiction to existing mandates. Second significant feature is that they redefine special and differential treatment for developing countries from being different rules for developing countries and developed countries to being longer periods of time for developing countries to catch up with and apply the rules that developed countries already apply, which is a kind of reverse special and differential treatment in that the richer countries basically don't have to do very much. The third common feature is that in the name of so-called transparency, they provide rights to foreign states and foreign companies to have comment on and to have those comments taken seriously when governments are proposing to introduce new laws or regulations that impact on their interests. So those are all common features. Very briefly, the domestic regulation of services ignored existing mandates under the Trade and Services Agreement and adopted new rules in something called a reference paper. And that reference paper has, despite the fact it's new rules that should involve an amendment to the GATS through a consensus process, have been pursued by popping them into each member's services schedules that doesn't have to go through the same processes. The second is on electronic commerce. And of course there is a work program on e-commerce underway in the WTO that has been sidelined by this, which follows rules designed by and for big tech companies that first found their presence in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. But it's complicated because the subgroup of countries negotiating this included the US, the EU and China, who aren't all on the same page, let alone developing countries' interests in this process, of which there are not that many. So it was complicated, but it became even more complicated recently when it was thrown into disarray by the US, when the US withdrew its proposals on data and source codes. And so what we've seen on 21st of February, beginning of the week, was the issuing of a new chair's text on e-commerce that's kind of e-commerce light. But the framework and structure of it, including the lack of any development dimension and the lack of effective protections, are expected to carry through if there is an expanded version of the e-commerce light to include those other matters. And the cover note to this new text says we haven't given up on those other issues and we are determined to continue negotiating them. The big issue this time in this ministerial is the third of the JSIs, which is investment facilitation, sometimes called investment facilitation for development, but there is no development in the investment facilitation agreement. There is not only no mandate for this negotiation, but there is a series of decisions in the WTO not to negotiate on investment until the Doha round is over, until there is consensus for such negotiations. Neither of those conditions is met. The agreement was launched last night, and there was an intention to adopt it at this ministerial conference. They intend to adopt it as what we call an Annex 4 plurilateral agreement, but to adopt it as such, they need consensus. There is not consensus, and what we are very concerned about is how there might be backdoor attempts to get that adopted in this ministerial. The fact that the DG in his statement this morning referred to investment facilitation as one of the deliverables of this conference when it is not even on the agenda is deeply concerning. And as a complement to that, maybe compliment's not the right word, those countries who have been challenging the illegitimacy of the investment facilitation agreement led by South Africa and India were vigorously attacked at the most recent General Council meeting, including by the Director General, in a way that is totally improper for a supposedly neutral international public servant. And she went for India and South Africa, and we are anticipating there may be more of that happening behind the scenes here. A final comment about that is that there has also been inordinate pressure brought on developing countries to sign on to this agreement and to build a sense of consensus and just a small number of holdouts. That has been done by China, and China has levied absolutely enormous pressure on a number of developing countries to get them to add their names to this, including, as I know personally, in some countries, completely bypassing the trade ministries, so the trade ministries have never even seen the agreement that the politicians have agreed to sign up to. And so, if this is allowed to happen, it creates a precedent for basically rewriting the WTO processes and rules by more powerful countries to cherry pick the issues of importance to them, to sideline what's of importance to developing countries, and to reassert their power over the organisation.
Thank you, Jane. Jane has been studying these issues and writing on them since the Uruguay round, so that is quite a lot of analysis going into that short statement. Next, we'll hear from Victor Manati with Demand Climate Justice from Slovakia and the United States on the so-called environmental joint statement initiatives.
Thanks, Deborah. Hi, everybody. In my 4 minutes, I'm going to try to make 3 points. One is why it's important that we deal with climate not in the WTO, but under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. 2, why the existing WTO rules have exacerbated global carbon emissions and brought us to the climate crisis. And number 3, what's on the table here this week in terms of new WTO rules with climate and environment that we should be concerned about. First of all, in terms of why it's important that we deal with this not in the WTO, but in the climate convention. Yes, the WTO does have special differential treatment. Developed countries are already trying to weaken this. Whereas in the climate convention, you have the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. What that means is some countries contributed much more to the crisis than others who are suffering the greatest impacts. For example, where I come from, North America, 4% of the global population, almost 1/4 of the global emissions since 1850. Compare that to Southern Asian countries, 25% of the global population, only 4% of the global emissions. So very uneven who has caused the crisis, and those who did have to do the most and have responsibilities to help others make transitions with finance and with technology. Also important is the role of civil society. Civil society doesn't really have a space. We have to fight for every inch here in the WTO, whereas in the Climate Convention, the trade unions are recognized, the youth organizations, the environmental NGOs, all are recognized constituencies with opportunities to make interventions, to interact with negotiators and the secretary and so on. We have none of that here. Secondly, I won't go a lot into why WTO's existing rules, but if you look at the core agreements of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Most Favored Nation, national treatment, the general exceptions, all of these things have contributed to destroying local and national cycles of production and consumption and putting countries' economies on a path where they have to integrate into global supply chains and extract ever more and more resources, externalize the ecological and social costs onto others, and that's helped to drive the ecological crisis to where it is today. You could go through the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement, the agricultural agreement, and also the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement, which is preventing the sharing of technology that we need to deal with the crisis due to monopoly patents by mainly companies in the global north. Lastly, let me talk about I'll just focus on 2 elements of the current WTO agenda that might be moving here this week to deal with the climate. Broadly, under the proposed agreement on climate change and trade, you have liberalizing environmental goods and services and dealing with voluntary eco-labels. But you also have the issue of fossil fuel subsidies, which is a very big problem. It's almost $1 trillion a year that still goes every year to contribute, where the state is somehow supporting the biggest source of emissions on the planet. But what we don't want to see is that mandate be given to the WTO, primarily because we've seen what's happened when the WTO has dealt with farming subsidies, now dealing with fishing subsidies, fishery subsidies. It's small producers and communities who suffer the most, and it's big producers who don't get really disciplined from their abuse of state support. So we might have to invent another place to deal with this, but it's really sad to see some NGOs, but they're here, supporting governments to move the subsidies agenda with the WTO mandate, but they claim they're not here to advocate. But this is something that I think largely the environmental community has not wanted to see WTO take over more climate policy making, and that would be a disaster if they got the subsidies for fossil fuels issue. Lastly, I'll flag the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, another proposed and existing carbon tariffs that the European Union, that the US is also considering, and the unfair burdens that these are already beginning to have on developing countries. It's not 10%, it's not 1%, it's 0.1% of the global emissions that the European Union CBAM would hope to reduce at the cost of increasing income for Europe of 2.5 billion, but costing the global south almost 6 billion a year. So really redistributing wealth to the north from the south by these measures. Yes, we have to find a way, and the way forward is through cooperation. It's through the global north, which has commitments in the climate convention to share technology and capacity building with the south. And that's why we need to see this dealt with, not here this week in the WTO, but to take that discussion back into the climate convention. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you, Victor. And I encourage all of you to see some of these issues on the agreements that Victor mentioned, as well as some of the concerns about the unilateral measures, as well as a positive agenda for trade and environment at ourworldisnotforsale.net/climate, and also related to the issues that Jane was talking about at ourworldisnotforsale/investment. We have 2 more speakers for you today. We will next have Africa Kisa, who is with the Africa Trade Network from Uganda. And the reason these speakers are going after all the others is because they talk about all of the different issues. Without further ado, Africa Kisa.
I'm not saying you always save the best for last.
I've saved the best for last.
These excerpts are part of the ATN Africa Trade Network statement that we issued on the 21st of February. We note that the WTO leadership is fixated on achieving outcomes in this MC13. And at the same time, African countries are engaged deeply in discussions regarding the balance between the quantity and the quality of such outcomes. Unfortunately, based on the issues that have the run-up to the MC13 and the way it has started, we feel that there is a large chance that Africa's issues might be sidelined, given the hot pursuit by the WTO leadership to achieve an Abu Dhabi package. And that is very critical for us. Bearing that in mind, we feel that the necessity to preserve policy space for Africa, especially for African countries, to be able to put in place their industrial development policies and rebalance trade rules for that purpose is critical. And it is critical not because Africa is vulnerable or a victim, like it is always presented in these declarations, but rather because Africa is a very strong actor in the global trading system. Therefore, we believe that the outcomes of the MC13 should provide Africa with the necessary policy space in all fronts: agriculture, e-commerce, fisheries, name it, in all fronts. This policy space is critical for a meaningful and qualitative integration of Africa in the global value and supply chains. The last aspect, the second last aspect, is the question of reforms that the WTO is so intoxicated about. Our feeling, well, the word intoxicated is not in the statement, that's a personal feeling. But our argument as the African Green Network is that preserving the policy space for industrial development should do, the reform should look at rebalancing the trade rules to promote industrialization and structural transformation. In other words, they should focus on addressing the long-standing challenges and mandates that had been committed earlier on. And lastly, I wish to talk about the issue of the process. We wish to note that even prior to the MC13, and again during the MC13 so far, there is continued use of underhand methods and techniques, especially by the WTO leadership, in order to secure a package. We hope that there should be no green rooms, and we also hope that the DG should express neutrality, especially when dealing with African countries. I wish to reiterate that the DG should not use Africanness to try and coerce or intimidate African countries agreeing to positions that might not be resonating with Africa's quest for transformation and industrialization.
Thank you so much, Akisa. On? I think it went off. It's not working anymore, huh? Okay. So our last speaker today, and I understand that we are getting very close to time, is Diego Lopez. He is with the International Trade Union Confederation, and will speak on workers' rights. And
so just let me know if you can't hear me properly, and I use my trade unionist voice. So I'm here on behalf of the ITUC, so it's the International Organization of Workers. We represent over 190 million workers in 169 countries. That's 340 national affiliates. And we're here because trade is an important matter for unions. All issues that are being discussed here today influence workers in one way or another. We have agricultural workers, we have fishers, we have platform economy workers, just to highlight a few. And these will all be impacted by the negotiations on agriculture, on fisheries, discussions on e-commerce. So this is the reason why we're here. And we consider that labor rights need to be better embedded within the WTO. And for this, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We already have the International Labour Organization, which is a tripartite body where workers are represented through trade unions, we have business, we have governments, and we make the rules for workers there. So what we think is that we need to reinterpret the WTO rules, bearing in mind the international treaties of the ILO. This understands that the WTO treaties sit within a broader set of international laws, including ILO norms, and therefore the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work applies to ILO members that are also WTO members. Therefore, we would like to seek an authoritative interpretation of the GATT and the GATS under Article 9.2 of the Marrakesh Agreement to officially acknowledge this. And this would lead to more open spaces for working on labor rights. But it should also lead to stronger relations between the ILO and the WTO. As I was saying, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need for the laws within the rules within the ILO to be implemented in the context of the WTO. And we have a good reason to do this in the context of the ILO's Global Coalition for Social Justice, of which the WTO is also part of. But it's also important that we encourage the respect of labor rights within supply chains. We have tools for that. We want due diligence to apply. We are promoting international labor standards and responsible business conduct instruments that we have in global supply chains, and we need to ensure this is put forward on issues such as the banning of products from forced labor, child labor. And trade unions are strongly pushing with other civil society organizations for a UN binding international instrument on business and human rights that will also contribute to the respect of labor rights within supply chains. And unions are also strongly concerned about preserving policy space for countries to develop their policies, their green industrialization, structural transformation process, as our colleague from Africa mentioned. We have affiliates in all countries around the world. It's not about the global North policies. All policies need to benefit the world and leave the policy space for development. So this also applies to our work around digital industrialization and e-commerce. So we need more space for governments to regulate e-commerce, and we cannot accept the current rules that are limiting that space to regulate e-commerce, to regulate digital economies, because there are also other spaces where this needs to be regulated. We need to regulate digitalization, yes, for sure, but it needs to be a rights-based regulation, and it needs to take into account all the factors coming from the different angles. So, for example, at the ILO 2025-2026, there will be specific discussion on decent work in the platform economy. We need important rules that protect workers within that discussion. And that needs to come from the ILO and be incorporated within other institutions. So that is the standard. In sum, we need to update WTO rules that prioritize social justice and respect labor standards for work. Thanks.
Great. Okay, thank you. I think we are at the end of our speakers tour, and I'd like to open the floor. Before we do, though, I'm going to ask my colleague Raja, because you have an event here at 3, is it okay to go a few minutes over?
Yeah.
So that we can have some questions for the speakers. Sorry. Okay. So immediately in this room afterwards, we had originally planned our press conference earlier to give us more time, but the situation this morning caused us to have to postpone it. So without further ado, are there journalists in the room who have questions for the panel? Please raise your hand. All right. Perhaps we, with that tour de force covered so many issues, I do want to recommend to you all 2 things. One, again, the directory. If you weren't here when I said it earlier, Melinda's holding it up. The lady in blue in the back there has the directory of CSO experts. We have a whole bunch of people here, more than these wonderful folks who are at the front, and you are welcome to interview them, to contact them. We have a summary article that includes links to a lot of our members' articles and things like that. So if you'll allow me just 1 minute to close. In terms of our demands, a summary of things that we all are in agreement on, the path towards a farmer and fisher and worker and environment and development friendly outcome this week, in short, would be to stop pursuing a distorted WTO reform agenda, to conclude the development agenda, on JSIs to stop pursuing plurilateral agreements at the expense of addressing real multilateral concerns in the supposedly multilateral body of the WTO. And if it's digital, environment, MSMEs, gender, investment facilitation, domestic regulation, they are all harmful to food, livelihoods, and sustainable development. To stop using the sustainability rhetoric to mask neoliberal policies and instead look at how trade contributes to climate change. And what changes do we need to existing WTO rules to limit and reduce that damage? And to agree to a real waiver on COVID-19 vaccines, we didn't even talk about today, therapeutics and diagnostics, and the TRIPS non-violation complaint moratorium. If you don't know what that is, we can answer that question as well. To oppose the moratorium on customs duties on e-transmissions, as Parminder talked about, and also Diego, which is just big tax evasion. On agriculture, to agree to an uncomplicated permanent solution for public stockholding, to agree to the special safeguard mechanism that's been on the table for a very long time, and to oppose the Cairns Group demand for more free trade in agriculture, and instead allow poor countries to protect their domestic food production. And finally, on fisheries, to allow developing countries to expand their artisanal fish production for food security and livelihoods, to uphold the existing UN Convention on the Law of the Sea rights for members. countries that cause global overfishing should have to reduce their fleets and subsidies and not just face restrictions on where they are now. In sum, most of our demands refer to actually shrinking the power of the WTO to control domestic economies, as well as stopping the expansion of the fail model. So we'll go ahead and close there. I really appreciate all of the journalists coming to hear from civil society today. We really appreciate it. A lot of journalists don't come to hear from civil society, so we really do appreciate that you're here. And we'll be available for comments throughout the ministerial. Thank you very much.